Thank you, Chair Miller. I think I'm just gonna stay here.
Okay.
I'm comfortable. I don't want to. Feel comfortable. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call the Urban Flood Safety Water Quality District Board to order and ask if there's any public comment. All right. We will start out with a presentation from Bill on the capital improvement program.
Your chair statement. And share access. Thanks. Okay. I have a couple minutes here to share some information about, a little more information about the capital improvement plan that was in your package. The summary is in the budget. This provides a little more detail than this offered there. I want to make sure to start off that this plan was put together by a group of staff, not just me huddled in a corner somewhere. So I want to make sure to recognize Amber Ayers, who's the project manager here, Anel Almendarez, who's the finance director, who's here. Jeremiah Hess is our newer pump station engineer. Josh McNamee is part of our operations team, so he was part of the CIP development. Andrew Riggs is our new asset management specialist. Colin Rowan, as you know, is the director of planning and public affairs. Harry Salmon, who's here in the room, the environmental program manager, and then Kevin Severson. All those folks contributed to development plan. I want to make sure to recognize their good contributions. Okay, next slide. Okay, so little CIP 101 for you, those who maybe not be as familiar with capital improvement plans. They identify short and long-term capital needs for the district services. They focus on capital investments rather than materials and services investments, so they have to have a capitalization policy. They do also represent a forecast of anticipated expenditures and the funding resources, so that it provides the 5-year outlook that we just provided, and it's more detail. And finally, it also supports your and the district's discretionary immunity, and which is a defense really for public employees as well as the agency itself from civil liability. Certainly can bring somebody in, or Allison can on the call can offer some more detail if you want to have that, but that's an important element there. So it allows, since you have a plan for capital investments, someone can't come back and say you didn't do X, Y, or Z, because if something happens, say yes, we recognize it's not, we haven't addressed it right away, but it is in the plan. So we have a documented plan to work with that.
Bill, do we have slides? Do we have these slides?
They're in the packet. They're after the detailed pages. About page, maybe 60 or so.
Yeah. It's a list of all the projects. Okay, if I move forward? Okay, great. I'm going to talk just briefly about how we prioritize all the capital needs that we feel are important and should be addressed. There's a series of criteria that we use to link projects to. So those criteria are listed up on the screen here. One is flood risk, which deals mostly with So you can imagine flooding, what's the likelihood or chance of flooding based upon an internal event, not necessarily so rainfall or snow melt runoff, as opposed to coming from the Columbia River or the Columbia Slough. So that flood risk is quantified in our process. But in addition, we recognize there's some risk associated with our levee system. And thankfully, the Corps of Engineers conducts a fairly routine assessment of our levees. And so we reference those assessments to help populate and understand what our flood risk is relative to a levee system. So flood risk deals with both internal and external factors. Emergency preparedness and redundancy, as you can note on the slide, it is fairly straightforward. It's our ability to be able to respond in the case of emergency. There's also a factor, though, of do we have the right assets and tools in case something goes down? So a great example, so for redundancy purposes, is here on campus. We have one of our largest pump stations here, Pump Station 1, which you walked past as you got to the building. For some reason, the power goes out, we can't get a generator in here. We actually have pipes behind us. There are 5 60-inch pipes that allow water to drain the middle slough here, assuming the water levels on the other side are lower than what levels in the slough. So that's an example of redundancy. Out of Pump Station 4 on Marine Drive, we do not have that type of redundancy. So Pump Station 4 would have a different type of score for redundancy in this case. Operational efficiency indicates just the frequency, how often we go to those assets. Asset integrity and dependability really reflects how old the asset is with respect to how much design life or service life is left in the asset as it's being operated. And we have added 2 additional criteria this year related to watershed health and equity. Watershed health piece is connected primarily with a scorecard, if you will, that the City of Portland's staff pull together to try to account for water quality, habitat, natural hydrology. So we leverage their information to help identify whether or not this particular project can advance some of those aspects of their scorecard. And the equity piece is a reference to whether or not the flood risk is going to support underrepresented populations. Is there a direct connection for improvement of that asset with their maybe lowering their flood risk? And so there are both quantitative and qualitative factors related to that particular criterion. We're still experimenting, honestly, on that particular criterion. We feel like this is a good step forward from what we had before, which is more of a yes, it deals with equity, or yes, or it doesn't. This is a little more advanced, and we're anticipating that this criterion will continue to evolve over time as we learn better of how we incorporate equity in this particular process of our organization. So the watershed health and equity pieces were both components of our new RRS purposes that we're trying to integrate as we're moving forward. So once the projects are prioritized, there's some other factors that affect where they lie within the CIP forecast. There's regulatory compliance. If we're out of compliance for some reason, that project gets bubbled to the top to make sure it gets funded. Additional financial support is a reflection of funding that's other than property assessments and the flood safety benefit fee. So whether it's bond or grant or some other type of funding mechanism, IGA, for instance, that project, it gets elevated as well. There are project dependencies for some projects because of the way things operate. You want to make sure something gets done first before you do something else. Imagine a pipe system, for instance. You don't want to upsize your pipe up on the top of the hill and have this tiny little straw at the bottom. you want a big pipe at the bottom and work your way back up. So there's some dependencies there. And then funding availability is another piece which I'll talk about in a moment. There's a section in your proposed capital improvement plan that talks about cost estimates. Wanted to pause just for a moment to talk about this because it's important that you see one number in the CIP, but that number really depends on the evolution, maturity of that project. So it's at the very beginning stages of the project development. That number is going to be in the middle, so not quite even in the middle. So it would be a class in technical terms. In this case, it's a class 5 project, which means it's one number, but the final cost could be 100% of that number at the end, or it could be 50% less than what that number is. So because there's limited information we have at the very beginning of the project, our accuracy spans are a lot wider. As the project evolves over time, the accuracy spans narrow down. So by the time you get to a quote, piece of equipment quote, or a bid from a construction contractor, your accuracy is plus or minus 5 or 10% or so. So there's one number in there, but and there's actually in the table, there's an indicator what class of number there is, and that gives you a reflection of how much confidence staff has on that one particular. So want to make sure I pause on that for a moment. The structure of the CIP is divided into 4 sections. One is related to the GEO bond related to projects. There's a series of drainage assets, as well as levee assets and operations or facilities assets. Those last 3 categories mirror what our asset management plan, our asset management structure is at the district. And so those terms are deliberate to make that connection to our asset management principles and how we approach and manage the assets that we do have. So a couple of graphics that represent what you partially have seen in the budget. I'll start with the GEO bond fund. This reflects on the bottom axis, it's by year. So FY 2026 represents fiscal year 25, 26. So FY 27 would be 26, 27, and so forth. You can see that the amount of money spent on the GEO bond funds rises considerably in FY 27 and 28. That's in line with expected increases in real estate agreements and utility locations, particularly in Delta Park and the Van Port sections of our managed floodplain. With a big caveat of what we've already discussed about funding and timing of PMLS and so forth. So this is assuming that PMLS continues on track. The last slide I have for today deals with the general fund, and it's, again, bottom axis reflects fiscal years for the next 5 years, and then there's a stacked bar chart for all the different categories. Remember, there's 3 different categories for general fund: drainage, levies, and operating costs. The drainage assets are larger, partly because there's a lot of moving parts. You think of a pump station, there's lots of things going on inside, as opposed to a levee that's fairly passive, right? There are things that go on the levee, and for at least for capital investments, there's not maybe as much of a need, particularly with GEO bond and PMLS work going on, and that's why you see more blue bar here rather than pink, for instance. The orange bars represents the operations assets or facilities assets. You can tell we're investing a little more on that in the early years here. That's in part to a reflection of the higher number of equipment assets. They're getting beyond their efficient service life. So our excavator, our bigger excavator needs replacements. It's beyond that sweet spot of when we should be replacing it now. There's more maintenance costs to keep it running than really is really appropriate. And our two mowers that we use to manage to mow the levee system every year are due to that same place. And there's also a need to bolster our tools for flood emergency response that are not reliably available on short notice. An example would be larger portable generators. There are some in the marketplace, but there's a big flood around or there's a power outage, we're not the only ones going to be interested in renting those pieces of equipment. So we have an interest to purchase at least one, and there's a possibility we're going to be able to find some grant money to help support that. Others are temporary flood walls that we're talking about for emergency closures. So there are two green lines that you see on here. The bold green line simply is just the sum of the bar charts at the top, but the dashed green line represents what the total is for the general fund, with that only reflect the property assessments and the flood safety benefit fee. So it doesn't include the bond, it doesn't include grants and other types of funding sources. I mentioned this because one of the factors I mentioned earlier about how you schedule projects over time is we're trying to keep at $2 million and below for capital improvements related to those two funding sources, assessments and flood safety benefit fee. And so I end up shifting some things back and forth a little bit to try to keep the total investments below that point at this point. So as a start, what's in your proposed CIP reflects that thought process. So with that, I'm done. Welcome to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Any questions, comments?
Yes, and just to reiterate some of what you were saying earlier, the numbers are essentially a best calculation at a point in time. But as you continue, you get more information, you continue to refine. So the CIP numbers are going to be different every time we look at them, because you go from 30% design to 60% design or something, and so it's sort of a moving target.
It is a moving target. That statement is accurate. And based on best practices in our industry, there are bands of how much that cost could go up or down. And that's what that graph was reflecting. And so as we get more information, we're intending that those bands get smaller. Captain Severson and I have been talking for some time about how important that 30% design milestone is, because that's when there's a pretty significant shift from a very large band to something that's a lot tighter. So we'll be talking more about that as we move along.
Sure. Bill, on that same around that same matter, is there a philosophy that you apply to the estimates early on? Like, okay, we've got an estimate number of 5 million, but we're going to add 20 million as a conservative budgeting buffer. Is there any sort of philosophy like that you apply that sort of manages the risk of exceedances?
Yeah,
or surprises?
Kevin, you want to take a stab at that first? I can fill in.
Sure. Yeah. So a lot of the time we're using a lot of our in-house expertise and our knowledge of these types of projects. I mean, some of them are, I would say, similar in nature. And we know from work that we've done sort of how much we could expect that to cost. We take a look at published rates of contracting price increases about how much those things might cost. We see, consultant fees and typically what is out there in the market. And then I guess, we do have our master planning efforts, like our drainage master plans that we draw from. And in that, the consultants will, provide estimated costs for repairs and usually be at least candid enough that we can decipher how much contingency they put on that. And so we may back that out and put our own contingency on it for consistency across. But it kind of just depends on, what's available. Okay, yeah, I would say most of our major projects, we have pre-planning level efforts, our major FEMA accreditation projects. Mark Wilcox under Colin Roman led a lot of those efforts to sort of give us some initial costs, so we're usually operating off of something that is a combination of our own in-house, technical knowledge and as well as consultant community expertise. That's usually pretty recent.
Great. Thank you. So for examples, maybe we could have up to 50% contingency right at the very beginning of construction costs for a planning level estimate. So if we cross our fingers, that's enough because there's not enough time really at planning level to really dig into the details. But by the time 30% is hit, we may be at 25, 30% contingency type of thing. So those are typical standards.
Thank you.
Director Hawkins. And it continues on the same thread. It may be early, this is an emerging topic, but do we have an idea of the potential effect of tariffs on the work in the 5-year plan?
Things are going to be more expensive.
And would that be considered within that range at all, or is that outside the scope of what is in that?
Yeah, outside. It'd be outside. We are considering security measures, but more standard security measure is the fence in good shape? Or do we have the right cybersecurity for our communication system that allows us to run the pumps, for instance, which we can do remotely? But really, we have not gone in depth quite yet, that type of.
Steel and other things are going to be more expensive, and again, we don't know.
We had the same conversation last night because I asked the question. I'm on the Bond Accountability Committee for Beaverton School District. And so a lot of their construction is steel. And they've got some big high school projects. And what they are seeing right now is technology is going up considerably. They do anticipate that steel costs are going to go up, wood costs are going to go up, but we don't know how much. So it's really difficult to estimate the impact of that at this point. So those things we'll have to continue to monitor.
That we are going to have you appoint a bond oversight committee that will be looking at all this spending. The team is working on a dashboard that will be public, that will reflect the changing environment. So we'll get a lot of oversight over the decisions that we'll be making as a result of the changing economic conditions. So I wish I had more certainty for you. I do want this board to get normalized that when we pulled all of this together to go to the voters, we did hire an expert outside firm to look at all of our contingency numbers. We were well within the realm of best practice. And our commitment to you is, regardless of what the change is, up or down, you're going to hear about it so that you know what we're doing and we'll engage you in decision making if we end up with costs exceeding our budget and we need to make changes in the prioritization of our investments. So we're working on developing that system and being able to portray it very transparently for you. And I think over the course of the next 9 months or so, you'll see some significant improvements in our ability to show these numbers to you and engage you in decision making about them. But I do want you to get used to the fact that it is quite likely that things are going to take longer and cost more than we expect. And we are committed to sharing that information with you regularly.
I guess that was my other question relative to risks, like the highest risk for flood safety in this plan if certain projects were to be slowed.
We've just begun that conversation, and we can probably give you some updates on our initial thinking at your next meeting, but we're not prepared to address that yet. And there would be a variety of policy factors that we would want to consider, both our own interpretation of risk, but also the loss of potential federal funds. So yeah, a lot to consider, and it's something that's actively being talked about by your staff.
Thank you. Along with the risk question, like my question and uncertainty is around the scheme, the prioritization scheme. And I'm really happy to see that watershed health and equity, you're folding those other values into a scheme. but is the general scheme flood risk emergency preparedness and et cetera, is that taken from an industry best practice kind of scheme, or is that something that you all have developed independent of like some other associations or insurance industry approach to priorities or the Corps' approach to prioritization?
Yeah, excellent question. Honestly, it's a mix. So I had referenced, other agencies that do, capital prioritization, and use that as a starting point. So this was several years ago where the original 5 criteria that are there. Then we made some modifications based on our experience here. So yeah, it's a mix. I will say that I'm on a national committee that actually is looking at CIP prioritization now. So it's a timely question, and I hope to be able to give some more information based on our education activities over the course of this next year and be able to influence the criterion that's here. One thing I'll note about this particular criterion is that all of those criterion are weighted equally. And so one thing that we to talk about next year is that whether that should continue that way or not. There's a good argument for, but there's also arguments to make some adjustments there. So I want to make sure that that conversation happens at this level, and the staff will bring some recommendations for you to consider at that point.
Thank you.
Director Olson, I think it's important to remember too that we do pretty intensive studies of each of the basins, and those generate the needs. And then that federal feasibility study that looked at our whole system also really identified what the weaknesses were. So there's a foundation of risk assessment that feeds all of this. So it's within an identified set of planning study identified risks that the CIP prioritizes from. So there's kind of an additional layer that goes into.
Thanks.
Seeing any other questions? Thank you, Bill. All right, we'll move on to the approval of minutes for February 20th. Hopefully you've had a chance to review those. Those are on pages 67 through 71. And thank you. I think it was you, Emily, who put a nice hot link in there to the minutes. And I would entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
I move to accept the February 20th, 2025 board meeting minutes as drafted.
Been a motion by Director Johnson to accept the February 20th board meeting minutes, seconded by Director Lane. Any discussion? All those in favor of approving the February minutes, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you, Winter. Any abstentions? All right, the minutes pass. The next agenda item we have is around the LCRB and signature authority modifications, and I will turn it over to Glory.
Thank you. In your packet today, you have 2 resolutions to consider in your role as the local contract review board, which we call LCRB. For the district. Staff are proposing updates to the LCRB rules and also refreshes to the signature delegation for contracts to eliminate some duplication in the board's approval process. Let's walk through the key items that are included in both of these documents. The board acts as the local contract review board for the district. The district has existing LCRB rules that were updated in December 2023 to integrate some changes in procurement dollar levels that were updated by the state of Oregon. It took them about 20 years. We were very thankful for those updates. For the vast majority of our purchasing, we follow the model rules implemented by the state of Oregon. You will see a long list of rules referenced in our LCRB rules. Those are all of those state purchasing rules that we follow word for word. The state does not provide rules for procurement of personal services, so our rules have more detail about those processes. The changes staff are proposing for the existing rules include some clerical updates to to the document to eliminate references to the legacy districts. Additionally, we're proposing some additional rules around integrating equity to our procurement processes. So let's take a closer look at those equity changes. Section 650 of the LCRB rules addresses equity in procurement. Staff have updated this section to align more consistently to the rules that are followed by Metro here in the local area. We've added a reference to self-identified firms in an effort to support eliminating barriers of entry for smaller firms. So the state has a registration process that they have for minority firms. It's a pretty comprehensive and difficult process for a firm to go through to get registered. So we are suggesting that we also be able to identify smaller minority firms that may not have gone through that registration process. We want to be able to do some outreach and provide some support. So if they're interested in doing that registration process, we can help them with some information about that. If they have questions or need to figure out how to find the forms, to try to be a resource for those firms so that they can get registered and have access to some other local governments as far as those equity rules apply. We do plan to do that outreach and have also actually joined a local group that has minority businesses as well, so that our procurement folks can start to do that outreach and start to build those relationships within the organizations. For each level of procurement, we propose differing levels of equity process. First, with our small procurements, which are those that are under $25,000, we're strongly encouraging the use of minority firms if they are available for goods and services that we're seeking to purchase. For intermediate procurements, we've added requirements around solicitation of MWESB firms. And for formal RFPs, we're adding the requirement for 20% of the proposal score to address equity, including certification and workforce diversity. We've also added an option of direct award to certified firms for contracts that are under $100,000. The second resolution that you have in your packet is some proposed updates to the signature delegation that we discussed last month. The delegation is unchanged for signature of contracts up to $100,000. The executive director has been responsible for delegation of those smaller contracts. And this version of the policy continues with that delegation, with contracts larger than $100,000 coming to the board for approval. We're also proposing a change to the delegation that allows the executive director to sign task orders that are within the value of an existing approved contract without having to seek a duplicate approval from the board. So right now, the board has approved the contract. And then when we do a task order, and if you remember, that was kind of our project, the way that we were managing the contracts, we would bring that task order back for your approval as well. So you basically were ending up approving the contract twice with each task order. So we're proposing in this new version of the rules that if you've approved the contract and we do a task order on that contract, that falls within the dollar amount of the contract, that we don't need to bring it back for a second approval. So with that, I can take questions. I've also put the language on for both of the resolutions if you're interested in moving forward with approval of both the changes to the LCRB rules and to the delegation.
Questions, comments?
I just have a procedural question, which is really down in the weeds and doesn't relate to either topic. Can one board member move that we adopt both in one motion, or do we have to do them one by one?
I think we can do both, can we?
That was a different set of weeds than I was.
Yeah.
Efficiency. Other questions or comments for Lori? All right. I would entertain a a single motion.
I would move to adopt resolution 2025-3-1, adopting updated contracting rules effective March 21, 2025. And I would also move to adopt resolution 2025-3-2, adopting the updated policy on district contract signing authority delegation.
And this is Allison. If you can hear me, I would suggest we just vote separately on each.
Thanks, Allison.
Second. Second.
Okay, so it's been moved, maybe we'll just do them one at a time. Please.
Again,
Yeah, you want to do one at a time. Let's just.
I can just do a roll call right now for each if you want.
Okay.
I think that's fine.
Yep, that works.
So starting with 2025-03-01, Director Calkins? Yes. Yes. Director Eismeister?
yes.
Director Mueller?
Yes.
Director Stegman?
Yes.
Director Ralston?
Yes.
Director Lane?
Yes.
And Director Johannes?
Yes.
We miss
Yes.
you?
No,
Oh, okay,
I
sorry.
just jumped my name. I was so excited.
All right, a roll call for 2025-03-02, Director Calkins? Yes. Director Johnson?
Yes.
Director Eismeister?
Yes.
Director Mueller?
Yes.
Director Stegman?
Yes.
Director Ralston?
Yes.
Director Lane?
Yes.
And Director Johannes?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. So both of those resolutions have been adopted unanimously. And it's back to you, Lori, for our financial report.
Oh, you guys are too fast for me.
Just so excited to hear about more things.
And thank you for the equity pieces. It's very near and dear to my heart. So I'm really excited to be able to move forward with that.
Share your support.
All right, here we go. Your board packet includes the January 2025 financial report for the urban district, which includes both monthly and fiscal year to date financial information for the consolidated district. Let's take a look at some of the key information. So the district has $15.5 million in revenue for the fiscal year to date, which aligns with the fact that collections are fully underway for our major sources of revenue, with collection of property assessments close to complete and 2 quarters of flood safety benefit. The flood safety benefit fee is billed and collected quarterly. Property assessments, as we've talked about a few times, are collected by the county on the property tax bill, which is due annually on November 15th. You can see that we've collected $9.1 million in assessments through January, which is almost the full amount of the annual assessment amount that we anticipated collecting this year. We've billed and collected the vast majority of the first 2 quarters of the flood safety fee, which is billed directly to the cities and to the county for unincorporated areas within the district. Grant revenues include state dollars for the 13th Avenue Pipe Project of $720,000. The accreditation projects of $678,000 and from FEMA for the PIR pump station project of $490,000. Interest rates on our LGIP account continue to be slightly higher than anticipated in the budget, resulting in earnings that are higher than budget. The state is quickly reducing the rate quite regularly. So at this point in the year, we don't anticipate the current trend to continue until year end. We really are seeing those rates go down fast in the LGIP, which is where we put our cash. Intergovernmental agreements include $708,000 from the city of Portland and $157,000 from the Port of Portland. Here we are with our budget appropriation. So this goes back to Phil's question about at what level are you responsible for monitoring our budget? So this slide shows the general fund spending results by budget appropriation line. And these are the appropriation amounts that we're required to stay within in order to comply with Oregon local budget law. First, you see the total annual budget for the appropriation lines. We've actually allocated the budget by month to support review of spending levels on a monthly basis. And this column shows the year-to-date budget allocation through January. This column is our actual spending for fiscal year to date. And this is our year-to-date variance for January. So as you can see, they're all positive variances, which means we're spending less than budget at this point. Finance and administration includes administration, IT, financial services, board services, and human resources departments. Our positive variance results from 2.5 FTEs in open positions, although we just filled one of those positions. And she is here today learning about the budget, which is very, very exciting. But we will continue to see that variance through the end of the year, because even though she's a full-time person, even at the end of the year, it will only count as half an FTE because she's only been here for half of the year. Planning and Public Affairs also has a 2 FTE open position variance, and we've hired one of those positions as well. So we're happy about that as well. This division is also experiencing timing differences for materials and services spending, including that $500,000 we've identified for new responsibilities. Engineering and operations has a 2.3 FTE open position variance, and we just did some hiring in the operations area. So we're going to see one of those positions filled in operations as well. So very exciting to start to see some of these positions filled. We're also seeing some timing differences in materials and services expenses for engineering and operations as well. For general fund debt service, there have been 2 debt service payments made this year. One to the county for the IFA loan that was a capital loan that transferred over from MCDD, and to Truist Bank for our capital borrowing that also transferred over from MCDD. In capital projects through January, we had significant activity on the 13th Avenue Pipe project. That project is completed, and the PIR pump station. So here is the year-to-date capital spending on the general fund. You can see the major spending to date has been on that 13th Avenue Pipe project. We came in significantly under budget on that project, which is great. And that project has been completed at this point. We also have spending on the 3 accreditation projects and the PIR pump station replacement. That's that project that is funded with pass-through grant dollars from the city of Portland. That I can take questions.
Thank you, Lauren. Questions, Director?
Just, it's sort of a follow-up, and not sort of, it is a follow-up to Director Ralston's question on slide 3, when I could actually see all those different categories. So just to clarify, say within planning, I think the budget was $3.5 million or something. They want to move money around within that category. That's staff's business.
Yeah.
But if it were to move between planning and engineering, that comes to the board.
Correct. We cannot.
Regardless of the amount.
Correct. We can't move any budget dollars between division lines, but within that, the types of expenses, we can move money around with the types of expenses.
I'm sure this has been covered at some point, but what happens at the end of the year if we continue to have like a positive variance of a certain amount? What happens to the like extra, I guess, extra money from our budget?
Yes, and we're assuming that we're going to have that extra, which is then carry forward fund balance.
Okay.
So that $12.8 million worth of fund balance that we were talking about, that includes these positive variances that we're experiencing right now.
Okay.
And that, especially if you see that final line, that contingency, that's what we talked about when we were looking at the 5-year projections, is if we continue to have those, if we continue to not have surprises and not need to use those contingency dollars, then that's going to allow us to start to look at some fund balance reserve policies where we can identify future spending, and those funds can be set aside by the board to fund that future spending. And typically you'll see that in the capital area, because I mean, Bill was really nice to say, oh, you know, I had to move money around to get the 5-year to fit within our budget. It was a major endeavor. He had to work really hard. And we're looking at some large expenditures out in years 6 through 10 that we'll really want to, as a board, start to look at those reserves so that we can make sure that we have funds available to meet those needs. questions?
Yeah, one more. Do I recall from our last meeting that 985,000 contingency doesn't cover a very big surprise?
It doesn't cover a very big surprise. So if we had a very big surprise, it would probably be some sort of a flood emergency, which in the past life would have been supported by FEMA. And if you have an unexpected grant that comes in, what we would do is we would come to you as a board and say, we've got grant funding and we've got spending. And if you approve both of them together, we can add it into our budget.
And we will rely on partners and other things.
And
in a
yes.
Serious emergency, and,
Yes.
we can borrow money or we can tap other funds, but we would do that in consultation with you. We are better than we've been, and we're still thin.
And our other option is a supplemental budget, and we do have fund balance. So if there are needs, we will do what we need to be able to make sure that we're doing the work that we're supposed to be doing.
Thank you. This is more just sort of a being transparent about kind of a personal philosophy of mine when I look at the variance analysis. I kind of focus on the capital projects line, and it's great if there's a positive variance, obviously from a budget point of view. But from a flood risk management point of view, it may mean that projects aren't getting done as soon as we had hoped and planned for, and that we may not be meeting flood risk mitigation as quickly as we had hoped for all sorts of reasons. Could be external, could be the core, could be all sorts of things. But I just wanted to be a little bit transparent about the way I look at the variance analysis, and my priority is to look at capital project spending rate.
And what I would say in response to that, particularly this year, this is only the general fund capital projects. It's not the bond spending, and we're really just getting started with those projects. This really is good news this year, because if you look, the big bulk of the positive variance that we're seeing is on that 13th Avenue pump station discharge pipe project. It is complete, and we have, a good $500,000 positive variance there. So that's not us falling behind on work. That's us being able to complete that work significantly less than budget. I would probably look to Colin maybe on the gate tower, the Columbia Slough and the Columbia River levee projects were a little bit behind on the spending there, but I don't think that means that we're behind on the project timing. We are learning. This was the first budget where we actually divided budget by month, and we didn't have a lot of history to be able to know how best to do that. OnHill is working very hard to improve that process again next year. I can't provide you the assurance that even with that we're going to be as close as we need to be with this monthly budget. We're going to continue to improve on that and continue to try to get better monthly budget spreads so that you can see the difference between falling behind on a project and maybe we just spread a budget by divided by 12, which doesn't really reflect what our planning efforts were as far as when we were going to do the work.
Thank you.
Go ahead. I'll add on to that response too. I'm very aware of the variance there too. It's something we're connected to. And what I think about that is how do we project start dates of projects moving forward? We recognize that we have to go through procurement type activities and other things, staffing up for the projects. And so we've done well at projecting some and not as well as others, honestly. And so we'll get better at that. And so the variance would reflect accordingly. But I too am very aware of.
And my intent in looking at that is really just to spark a conversation when a variance is seemingly high or seemingly high. It's just like, let's have a chat about it and figure out or inform us about your view of that. So, as you've already said, there's a lot of different reasons that could cause that. Some of them are very positive, like coming in under budget, that kind of thing. But I think from a board point of view, I think it's good for us to have that quick conversation about why that particular variance may be outside of what we would normally expect.
And one of the things that we want to look at for the Bond Accountability Committee is to provide them some very transparent reporting on our planned timelines for projects. And if there's slippage, we'll want to be able to identify that so that there's an awareness of any delays that might be happening. There may be decisions too to move things around, and that really will be up to our engineering team to be able to address those sorts of things. Again, as we're faced with a lot of uncertainties about federal funding, we're already kind of regrouping and saying, are there things that we can move forward? What are the risk areas? How can we utilize the funds that we've identified within the project budget for next year on different things if we're not moving forward as quickly on the PMLS projects? So those sorts of conversations are happening all the time with our team. And what we're trying to think through right now is how do we best reflect that so that you can see what's happening with those projects?
Thanks.
We're getting those 3 FEMA projects to 30% design. So we're going to go from the design phase to the construction phase, and you'll see spending increase. And just a shout out to the team for managing all of that, making good progress on this important project.
Sort of on the big picture, I think in terms of potential public reaction, the next time we come for a bond measure or something like that, people will be looking and should be looking all the time. Are we spending the money the way we said we were going to the last time something was on the ballot? And so I think that this kind of transparency and conversations really good for us to be transparent with the public that's putting the money out on the table.
And it is going to be interesting because a big part of that bond money is the local match related to PMLS. And so some of that timing is out of our hands, right? If we start to see slips with the Army Corps, if they start to have staffing challenges, for example. So we haven't lost our people that we're working with, but they're now having to pick up projects from folks that have been laid off. And how is that going to impact our project timeline? We don't know yet, but those sorts of things will impact the timing of our spending. And I assure you, Bill and his team have done a great job of kind of projecting, but when you see that huge amount of bond spending year after next, that's not going to happen. It's going to start to shift down a little bit. We know to anticipate that. So, and we'll just keep working on it and provide you with the best information we've got as we go. Questions, comments?
Thank you, Chair. I just want to offer a comment following up on Lori's comments and Director Calkins' comments earlier, which is to voice support for this board considering a reserve policy moving forward, or perhaps even a capital reserve policy, especially when we have situations where there's been some capital savings, I guess, compared to budget. We're in a period of uncertainty, right, in terms of economic impacts of federal policy in particular. And I think we need to prepare for that.
Thank you, Director. When is the appropriate time for us to have that?
This summer into the fall is as we start to get into our budget planning, that'll be a good time for us to start to talk about reserve policies. Once we're planning on closing out the year-end financial audit is going to start in August. You're going to hear from them next month, the auditors, as they talk about starting their work. Once we kind of get those final numbers and know where we've ended up with fund balance, then we can start to have a better conversation about that. You did inherit a somewhat designated fund that's being used for projects going forward, and I referenced it a little bit. So the dollars that rolled in from Penn 1, Penn 2, and SDIC in our negotiations and finalization of all of the agreements to pull people together, the one thing that we agreed to is that those funds were designated for use within the old district boundaries. And what we're doing with those funds with the funds that are remaining at the end of this year is we're identifying them for projects only. And the philosophy there, this year it was for operations in that area and projects, but the philosophy now is that we've collected assessments for a year as the new district. So the operations costs are really being covered. And so we've identified those designated funds, which we're estimating, you know, to the $2 to $3 million amount to carry forward next year for projects only. So you do already have a quasi project reserve sitting there. And we're looking at those, the most important projects to do in those areas to utilize those funds. But that does, so we're starting with a little bit of a nest egg that we can talk about as well.
You know, the county, like we have a policy that says certain percentage of unspent money. So we don't have anything like that in place yet. So that's something we can get.
And so that's what we want to talk about.
Be recommending something to you as we go into the next budget, but I think we can talk about it going into the budget so we can start to plan how much revenue we'll need. We're with you. We want to serve.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Questions or comments?
I have just one quick question about capital spending. Should we expect to see like a distinct annual shape, like is summer construction season? Or is it not necessarily?
Should.
Should not.
Should. Yes. A lot of our projects, particularly in the drainage assets piece, relate to work near the water. And so for some of you might know, there in the regulatory world, there's something called an in-water work window. So you can't do work outside of that window. And in the Columbia Slough watershed, that window is June 15 to September 15. And so you should expect that for once the project gets to construction, you'll see that spike in the summer months. The fun thing for us is that that splits 2 fiscal years. So we have to try to estimate how much comes early. And so we make that projection. And so yes, generally in this case, the Columbia River has a different in-water work window, November through March, February-ish. Yeah, so when we're doing levee work, that influences the work, but generally it's the slope. So hope that answers your question. Yep.
Any other questions?
Work windows are to protect fish and wildlife.
All right, I'm not seeing any other questions or concerns. I do want to thank Margot who came and joined me. I had the opportunity to do a presentation for the East Suburban Democrats. And Margot did a great job of asking or providing a lot of the technical questions. So I just wanted to appreciate her.
Hi. Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Margot Week. I'm our new senior public affairs. Been lurking back here. But yeah, so it is the end of my 6th week. Learning a lot. It was a joy to come and join you for that event. It was just wonderful to kind of get those questions out wild. So yeah, getting up to speed. We'll have a big day coming up next month with your guys' board meeting, also a little tour with Representative Dexter that we confirmed this morning. And we'll be meeting with the Christian neighborhood as well. But yeah, so we'll have more context for the hearing meeting.
Yeah, so if you get a request to speak at a public event, I think Margot would be happy to help you.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you, Margot.
Thank you.
All right, is there anything else for the good of the order? I'm not hearing any, so our meeting is adjourned and we will see you April 9th virtually. All right.
Yeah, it's 4. Well done.
Wow.
Wow.